This company. Good afternoon, dear community partners and empowering for temporary foreign workers, Kairos partners. Thank you for watching today to be part of this amazing presentation. Thank you, Stephanie, for your time and for your knowledge to share your knowledge with us. Welcome everybody to this information session. The Government of Canada's Temporary Foreign Workers Program has provided 2.18 million in funding to Kairos Canada to support and help empower temporary foreign workers, primarily in the agricultural sector during the COVID-19 pandemic and concluding probably on March 22. Kairos used the Government of Canada funding to expand their support and services to temporary foreign agricultural workers by partnering with organizations in the Atlantic provinces and in Ontario. So in Ontario, for example, Kairos partnered with Care for International Workers that is sponsored by Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic. Care is made up by 9 agencies: the Consulate of Mexico in Leamington, Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic, the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, Windsor Essex Compassionate Care Community, the Mera Collective Meditation and Witness Support, the Temple La Buena Semilla, the Neighborhood Organization, the Windsor Essex Community Health Center, and the Frontier College. So CARE is participating with 6 partners to develop this project. Today, one of the legal supporting agency is the Grace Bruce Community Legal Clinic is going to present an information session about employer-provided housing and COVID-19 requirements. So today, our speaker is a lawyer, is Stephanie Reid. She is the lawyer at Grace Bruce Clinic. Her work includes legal services in the areas of housing, social assistance, government pensions, employment, and indigenous issues. She is also active in community development and outreach activities in her region that focus on educating and empowering vulnerable communities. So we are very happy to have Stephanie Reid here doing this amazing presentation. So welcome, Stephanie. I'm so glad for having you. So we can start now.
Thank you so much, Francie, for that really lovely introduction. And I'm so happy that I can be here today to present to you, and I really appreciate the invitation by CARE for International Workers and Kairos to be here today. So as Francie mentioned, I am a staff lawyer at the Grey Bruce Community Legal Clinic. We provide legal services for Grey and Bruce counties. And my main areas of practice are in housing, social assistance, government pensions, employment, some human rights, and Indigenous outreach work as well. So I'm presenting to you today on employer-provided housing and COVID-19 requirements, focusing on the rules for temporary foreign worker housing. As Francie mentioned, there is a new auditor's report with recommendations that has come out that may change some of these rules around housing, but we don't know exactly how that will play out at this time. So as of right now, these are the rules, but of course, like any legal matter, this is subject to change in the future. So I'm just going to make sure, and please bear with me. Did that switch slides?
No, we are still in the
sorry.
video.
My computer is doing 2 screens separately now. So okay.
Now we are in the second slide.
Okay. So now I know how to do it. Thank you for your patience, everyone. So I do want to start off with just doing a quick land acknowledgement. So I am giving this presentation from Owen Sound, Ontario. I know that there are attendees from various parts of the province and potentially even outside of Ontario. But I do want to make a land acknowledgement for the land that I'm currently on. So the land on which the Grey Bruce Community Legal Clinic is situated has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people, which include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Grey and Bruce counties, including Owen Sound, constitute much of the original territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which was surrendered in a series of poorly honored treaties from 1836 to 1861. The Saugeen Ojibwe Nation is currently made up of the Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, strong and resilient communities in Bruce County. Today, Grey and Bruce counties are also home to many Indigenous peoples, including Métis people from across Turtle Island. It is also home to Black peoples and other peoples of color, some of whom were brought here as slaves and others as indentured labor. We acknowledge that systemic racism and the legacy of colonialism continue to exist in Canada. We are dedicated to working together to dismantle these oppressions. We are grateful to Indigenous peoples for allowing us to be part of this territory, and we welcome the opportunity to work with them towards reconciliation and social justice for all, and we are all treaty members. So thank you for listening to the land acknowledgement, and I'm sure that for many people the land acknowledgement might be different depending on what land you are on today. So I also want to, before we get started on the actual subject matter of this presentation, I do also want to give a quick disclaimer to say that, first of all, the content of today's webinar constitutes legal information only, and so that's really not a substitute for legal advice. Legal advice is specific advice about a specific set of facts, and it really can only be obtained in consultation with a legal representative. Legal information is information about rules and regulations that exist and provides an understanding of the legal framework in which we're operating. The information provided in this webinar is accurate to today's date, which is December 10th, 2021. So please note that federal programs and rules and regulations can be changed, and various criteria can be revised. So if you are in a specific legal situation that relates to something that we speak about today, we do urge you to seek a legal consultation either through our office or through the Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic that Francie works with, or by another legal office in your location. Okay, so sorry for my slow slide changing here. So today I'm going to be speaking about employer-provided housing in the context of temporary foreign workers in Ontario. Much of what I'm saying is applicable in other provinces as well, because I'm mainly going to be discussing federal rules and legislation. So if you are tuning into this webinar from a province other than Ontario, most of what I'm saying will apply, and I will try to highlight anything that is Ontario specific as we go through, because I understand there may be some attendees coming from other provinces. The three main topics that I'm going to be covering today are, first of all, the general rules around employee-provided housing for temporary foreign workers. The second topic is going to be the inspection requirements, so the requirements that the housing must meet in order to qualify as housing under this program. And then finally, I'm going to talk about COVID-19 provisions, because there are some changes that have come about to the rules to account for the special needs around COVID-19. And feel free as I go, I will make time for questions at the end of this webinar. But if anybody has a pressing question that they would like to ask as we go, I'm happy to stop and answer questions also. So the first thing I want to talk about are the general rules for housing in the context of employer-provided housing for temporary foreign workers. I will use the acronym in my slides of TFW for temporary foreign worker, just because it is a bit of a mouthful. And I want to be really clear that these rules apply in that context only. These are not the rules that apply for other types of housing, for example, rental housing in the province of Ontario. Okay, so the general framework, just so that we kind of understand where this all comes in, is that in order for an employer in Canada to hire temporary foreign workers from another country, the employer must complete something called a labor market impact assessment, or an LMIA. And as part of the LMIA application, where it's for temporary foreign workers and the employer is proposing to house them, and under certain programs they're required to house them, the employer must demonstrate that they can provide adequate, suitable, and affordable housing for their workers as per the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So I've underlined the words adequate, suitable, and affordable, because those are the different things that we really want to think about in terms of what is adequate housing, what is suitable housing, and what is affordable housing. The housing can be either on site of the workplace or it can be off site. And it has to respect maximum occupancy rules as defined within the local bylaws around that. Housing must be available to all temporary foreign workers from the date of arrival in Canada until the date of departure. So that has to be covered for the entire time that the temporary foreign workers are in this country, in Canada. So when we talk about affordable, there are obviously going to be costs associated with housing. And the employer is allowed to charge their workers for the cost of housing. However, there are restrictions in the federal rules around how much can be charged, depending on the type of housing that's being offered. So for farm workers, where housing is being provided on the farm, the farmers can charge a maximum of $30 per week for each worker for their housing. And this has to be prorated for any partial weeks. For off-site housing, for lower skilled workers, and by lower skill we're going with the skills designations through the Canadian government's legislation. So for the lower skill workers, the maximum that can be charged is still the $30 per week. For offsite housing for higher skilled workers, the cost for housing is no more than 30% of the worker's monthly income. So those are the caps on what the employer can charge for housing in each of their scenarios. I did put in a note here that those costs of $30 per week, or up to 30% of the monthly income, that is the total cost of housing for the workers. So the employer cannot add on any additional charges, for example, to recoup the cost of housing inspections or costs for renovations or other upgrades. The employer cannot say, well, your rent is $30 a week, but I'm also going to recoup this additional amount each week to go towards my renovation costs. That all has to be covered within the $30 per week. Whoops. Sorry. And then, as I mentioned earlier, as part of the application for the Labor Market Impact Assessment, or the LMIA, employers do have to have their worker housing inspected. So an LMIA can be started, and the processing can start before the inspection is done, but the LMIA cannot be issued until the employer can show that they've actually passed the inspection that's been done by the licensed individual. So under COVID-19 restrictions, there is the option of virtual inspections which can be done by video and time-stamped photos, and that's available at this time. But either way, no matter how they're being done, those inspections still do have to be done. And I'm seeing a hand is being raised here by Roland. Roland, did you have a question you wanted to ask at this point?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Would you please define the accommodation provided by the employer? So would that includes, we have some seafood worker here in New Brunswick, and the employer provide for their apartments, but the amount that you mentioned there is more than $30 per week, what they charge. So are they in that situation, or that's a different one?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I'm sorry, I always feel like I'm being evasive when I do this, and I'm not meaning to be evasive at all, Roland.
Yeah.
But I can't give specific legal advice to a specific situation in today's webinar.
Okay.
But it's certainly, you're identifying a really good question to explore with a legal representative. So depending on how workers are classified and how that housing has been provided, they're not farm workers living on a farm. So that $30 a week may not apply in their circumstances, but I think that it's a good thing to explore, because there definitely are rules around caps on the amount of rent, and just depending on exactly what the rent arrangement is, it's something that you should definitely get some specific legal advice specific to the situation on.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I can't dig into it more.
Problem.
I'm not meaning to be evasive. I just can't give specific legal advice in this context.
Because I have been aware of this accommodation rate since maybe 6 years ago, and they always ask me about that.
Mm-hmm.
And because a lot of what happening here in our side is a lot of employers are buying houses and building their own apartments and then renting it to the workers. So
and I think I am going to cover that briefly a little bit later in the presentation, because there are a different set of rules where it's considered to be rental housing, and the rent, like if it's considered not employer provided housing, but it's a rental that happens to also be owned by the employer, then there's a different set of rules around how that rent is set. And the rent is set in that circumstance based on market rent being divided equally among the tenants. So, and I think that I included that in this presentation, but just to be clear that the rates I described were for employer provided housing, and that sometimes it seems like it's employer provided housing because it's a house owned by the employer, but it's actually like they are renting a house that happens to be owned by the employer.
So how do they differentiate that one? Is it when they apply for LMIA, they will say it's not employer provided? They can say, it's not. I don't have an employer's provided accommodation. So within their LMIA application, they can say like that. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think I rest my case.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm glad we could be helpful.
I also want to mention, Roland, I want to mention something about it. Before the temporary foreign workers are coming to Canada, the employer has to apply for the LMIA, and also has to, they have to do an inspection. It's an inspection before they came to Canada. So there are many types of housing offered by employers. So depends of the purpose The purpose is just to provide housing for temporary foreign workers. They are part of the obviously of the housing inspection. So include the trailers, the houses, the farmhouses or instant homes, new or old and converted housing on farm property, and also motels and apartments. Just is the purpose to provide housing for temporary foreign workers is the reason who can just fit that kind of housing into the inspection from the Ministry of Labor and the other local health units. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Francie. Feel free to jump in at any point, Francie. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to jump in.
I think Connie sent a message. Connie has some information about it. So
Okay.
she wants to share that information. She said during the questions and answerings, but yeah, if you can do it, welcome.
Yeah, that's if anyone would like to interrupt, I'm always happy to have interruptions because I think it makes it a little less boring than just me talking. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about inspection requirements and the standards for employer provided housing. And again, these inspection requirements can be done by local inspectors, but the standards are federal standards. So the first thing I wanted to talk about are the standards, because I think that it's helpful for people to know that the inspection requirements are publicly available, and they can be found through the Employment and Social Development Canada website. So if you search for Schedule F for Housing Inspection Report, Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program and Agricultural Stream, that will give you the set of inspection requirements that need to be met by employer provided housing. So I think that it's helpful for people to see what those requirements are and to understand that while there may be quite a bit of overlap with other sets of housing standards that exist either through provincial or municipal rules in different areas, that this is a federally determined set of guidelines. So I do want to go over some of those requirements just so that people have an idea of what is involved. So the first part of the inspection deals with the exterior of the building, and it requires that the building is on well-drained ground and that it's 30 meters from buildings that house animals or poultry unless the two buildings are separated by a foundation wall. It needs to be waterproof and weatherproof. So that includes the roof and the walls. So no leaks and no, cold or heat coming in. If it's a mobile home, it has to have skirting. So that's the piece that goes around the bottom of the mobile home. There need to be exterior garbage containers that are rodent proof, and it has to be detached from any building that's used to store inflammable items. So those are the exterior requirements. Most of it is pretty sort of common sense, but it's good to kind of think through this checklist. For the interior of the building, the interior has to be in good condition and it has to be properly sealed. So again, that there isn't the ability for weather or water to come in. There has to be adequate lighting and ventilation, and the ventilation has to be, there has to be like actual ventilation provided if the house is not well ventilated. Screens have to be present on all windows and door openings, and it has to be free from any pests. So that includes rodents and pest insects. There have to be basic and adequate furnishings, working clean appliances, and that includes one fridge for every 6 workers. There has to be hot and cold water that's clean, and it has to be free of safety hazards. And then there are some specific requirements that relate to actual, safety considerations. And so those include that rapid emergency evacuation is possible. So it has to be really easy to get out in the case of an emergency. There has to be an on-site functioning telephone. There has to be functioning accessible fire extinguishers and functioning smoke detectors that are directly outside sleeping areas and in the kitchen. And so those are really important things to think about, especially things like the rapid emergency evacuations being possible, because sometimes when older buildings are being used or less permanent housing is being used, that's something that could end up being compromised. So it's important to recognize that these are the safety requirements that exist. Whoops. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. I keep struggling with my slides here. My apologies. So for sleeping requirements, it's important that sleeping areas are partitioned from living areas. So it can't just be one big open room. Beds cannot be required to be shared. So each worker must have their own individual bed, unless the workers are a couple that have expressed that they want to share a bed. And beds have to be 20 centimeters off the floor and 45 centimeters apart. And I used this picture of two beds that I found through PowerPoint, but when I look at it, I'm actually not sure if these two beds are 45 centimeters apart. So this is not an example of what you should do. It's just a picture of beds. And then another important note is that during any quarantine periods, beds have to be further apart. So beds actually have to be 2 meters apart when workers are in a quarantine period, for example, upon arrival into Canada. And during the quarantine periods, bunk beds can only be single occupancy. So you can't have both lower and upper bunks being used during the quarantine periods. Workers also have a right to have access to washing facilities. So there have to be working showers, at least one for every 10 workers, working toilets that, again, need to have at least one toilet for every 10 workers. There have to be sinks close to the toilets and a washing machine and dryer on site for every 10 workers as well. Which I think that it's important to understand that those are also requirements, because those might not be understood to be requirements necessarily.
Sorry, Stephanie. I want to say Michelle shared some information.
Okay.
She say she's from OCAO. She says something to add to the list of safety requirements is that the address of the housing and any other relevant information relocation should be posted in case workers need to call 911 or other assistance. So this is, yeah, has to be part.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I should add that into the slide. So thank you for bringing that up. Because especially with many rural properties, that may not, the address and location may not be obvious, right? Some of those rural addresses especially are a bit hard to understand. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and if I can just add, Stephanie, thank you so much. I'm not sure exactly how to get a standard changed. I think that was also part of the question, but we certainly have heard quite a number of instances where workers are trying to call for help, but they don't know what the address is of the building that they're in or their housing that they're in, or can describe how to get there. So anyway, it is a real issue. And if that could be part of the housing inspection, I think that might be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I know because Owen Sound is a city, a small city, but in large rural area, I can really understand how it's often not intuitive what an address is, right? And the way that emergency services dispatching works, you need to know the exact address. So that's a really good point. So one thing to know is that employer-provided housing is not mandatory for workers. So the employer has to provide the housing if that's part of their LMIA. But the workers can choose to live elsewhere. So a worker can choose to leave the employer-provided housing and seek private housing elsewhere. Depending on the type of housing that they're in and the agreement they have, they may have to provide some advance notice of their intention to do this. But outside of that notice period, the employer cannot charge workers for housing if they're living elsewhere. So it is often, in certain circumstances, it's more affordable for the worker to stay in the employer-provided housing, but if the worker chooses to live elsewhere, they do have the option to do that. So yeah, and if people have questions that I'm not noticing, feel free to unmute and just interrupt me, or I appreciate Francie also keeping track of that because I sometimes don't see it.
We had one question. We had one question.
Sure. Yeah, what is it?
Michelle, she said, if the house is owned by the employer, then workers are then tenants and have tenants' rights. Is that correct?
So yes, yes, it is correct. Although in Ontario, depending on the agreement, so in Ontario, and I don't know, I'm sorry, Michelle, I don't know which province you're joining us from, but in Ontario, the Residential Tenancies Act is the act that applies to rental housing within our province. And not all employer-provided housing is going to actually be covered by the Residential Tenancies Act, depending on whether it's located on a farm and it's part of the employment agreement, then it may not be covered by the Residential Tenancies Act. So again, this is where, if there's a specific case that you have in mind, and again, I am really not wanting to appear to be avoiding questions, but if there's a specific case that you have in mind, it's definitely worthwhile to speak with a legal representative to get an opinion on that specific situation. But if it's a situation of an off-site rental house that happens to be owned by the landlord and that the workers are renting that house, then in Ontario, the Residential Tenancies Act would apply and all of those tenants' rights would go with those workers. So it really is fact specific whether that piece of legislation applies, but certainly these inspection requirements that I'm speaking of, those would apply where the Residential Tenancies Act doesn't apply. So all of these standards would have to be met, even if the Residential Tenancies Act did not apply.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I should have been asked the question more clearly, because my question was related to living accommodations off of the farm. So you answered that in terms of the tenancy agreement does apply to that. Thank you.
Okay. We also have to mention that temporary foreign workers are not required to stay in the housing provided by the employer and may choose to live and find a private accommodation. So that private accommodation has to be obviously meet the requirements for the Residential and Tenancy Act. And always the temporary foreign workers has to provide notice to the employer about the departure date. In order, because they are, the employers are taking money from the housing, so they have to inform to the employer in order to stop just charging for that.
Yeah, and in that scenario that Francie's describing, so if there was a scenario where there was on-farm housing that was being provided by the employer, if the employee or temporary foreign worker decided that they wanted to move out to private accommodations, because the Residential Tenancies Act wouldn't apply in that circumstance, they would not have to give the 60 days notice that would be required under the Residential Tenancies Act. So sometimes it's a good thing to not have the Residential Tenancies Act applying. And as I mentioned, even where it doesn't apply, these federal inspection requirements continue to apply. So it's not just for the inspection and then they can stop meeting those requirements. Those need to continue to be met throughout the time that the workers are staying there.
Yeah, we had more questions, but we are going to leave the questions until the end. Yeah, in order to let Stephanie to continue with the presentation. So keep your hand up. So later we can just answer your questions.
Thank you, Francie. And I'm glad there are questions. It means people are interested. So it's always a good thing. Okay, so the last major topic I wanted to cover today is just talking about the changes that have come in around employer-provided housing for temporary foreign workers and COVID-19, because there are some additional considerations that apply, which, for obvious reasons, because of the efforts to limit that spread. So, a lot of this is going to feel pretty common sense to us now that we've been dealing with the pandemic for so long. But as I had previously mentioned, there's a quarantine period when workers first come into Canada from a foreign country, and that's a 14-day quarantine period. And during that time, the employer is required to house the workers and to pay them. And so in terms of requirements during the quarantine period, I mentioned earlier that beds have to be separated by 2 full meters rather than 45 centimeters, and bunk beds have to be single occupancy. During the quarantine, there can be shared kitchen, bathroom, and common areas for the workers, but they have to be set up with enough space to allow workers to maintain a 2-meter distance throughout the quarantine period. And then during and after the quarantine, the employer is to provide supplies for workers to clean and disinfect the common areas. And that's, provided by the employer on the employer's cost, not the workers. And then the employer is also required to post information about COVID-19 precautions in the workers' first language within the house as well, so that the workers have that information accessible. And then another scenario that, of course, can play out is, aside from the initial quarantine period, there could also be subsequent periods of quarantine or isolation that are required, where a worker has shown symptoms of COVID-19 or has, been exposed to COVID-19. So in a case where a worker is showing symptoms of COVID-19, they have to be provided with a private sleeping area and private washroom facilities. So if it's not possible for the employer to provide this on site, like if their employee housing just doesn't work for that on their farm or on the work site, then the employer is responsible for providing that in an off-site location. And again, the employer is responsible for the cost of that. And also, if a worker is in isolation due to COVID-19 concerns, so if they're isolating due to like the public health orders around their exposure or their symptoms, the employer is also responsible for arranging for food and medications to be supplied to those workers so that the workers can eat and have access to medication without having to leave their isolation. So all of these things that the employer is responsible for that means not only are they responsible for arranging it, but they're also financially responsible for it. So there can't be a recouping of those costs later on out of the worker's salary. That's their responsibility to bear. And so in terms of consequences for non-compliance, so if an employer breaches any of the COVID-19 requirements, at this time they can actually be fined, and that fine can go up to $1 million. So it's a pretty hefty fine for employers that are breaching the COVID-19 requirements. They also can be banned from hiring temporary foreign workers in the future. So there can be a permanent ban on that hiring. So they're pretty serious consequences for breaching these rules. On the flip side, the Government of Canada does recognize that some of these requirements are expensive for employers, and some of the changes in housing requirements are going to be expensive for employers. So the Government of Canada does actually have several different funds set up to support employers to ensure that their housing does comply with the requirements. And so I think I have a typo here. So employers cannot get out of meeting these requirements. So I left out a really important word on this slide. So that should say employers cannot get out of meeting these requirements on the grounds that they aren't able to afford them. So if an employer is proposing to bring temporary foreign workers into Canada to work for them, then they are undertaking to meet these requirements, and they cannot use the reasoning that they can't afford to meet these requirements. They are required to meet these requirements, but there are funds out there to assist with that, which is good. So one of the questions that's obviously going to come up is, what do I do if I have concerns about a housing situation or any other situation related to temporary foreign workers and their employer? So there are a few different options. So one is that Service Canada, which is of course a federal agency, has a confidential tip line that workers can call, or people who have information about workers can call to report breaches by the employer. And that can include breaches related to the housing, but it also can include other breaches by the employer. Where concerns are specifically about housing or COVID in the context of housing, concerns can also be reported to the local public health agency or local municipal property standards inspectors or provincial property standards inspectors, depending on who has that responsibility within the region that you're in. I have put an important note here that reporting an employer to these authorities could have repercussions for a temporary foreign worker's employment. So it is a good idea to seek some legal advice before taking these steps, if that's available to the worker, just to understand, what the different outcomes might be of making these reports to be able to be prepared. But it is important for workers to know that there are these places where these concerns can be reported if it is an ongoing problem. And the same goes for the people who are supporting the workers as well. So I do want to just bring everyone's attention finally, before I wrap up here, to this website. So I've put the actual link here within this PowerPoint presentation, and this PowerPoint presentation will be available to those who would like it. I will have to correct that one slide where I left out an important word. But this is a website that the Government of Canada maintains. So it contains up-to-date information about the coronavirus disease in Canada, including statistics and vaccine information and so on. So this is a good resource if you're trying to kind of track what's going on with COVID-19 and how that's affecting the various regulations that we're all having to kind of comply with. And I am wrapping up here, and I'm happy to take questions shortly, but I do just want to do a little blurb about community legal clinics in Ontario. So as I mentioned, I work for the Grey Bruce Community Legal Clinic, which is located in Owen Sound, Ontario. Francie, who invited me here today, works for the Windsor Essex Bilingual Legal Clinic. And legal clinics in Ontario we are nonprofit agencies that provide information, advice, and representation on various legal issues, including social assistance, employment, government pensions, housing, and many other areas of law, but not criminal or family law. We are funded by Legal Aid Ontario, and we have local independent boards of directors within each of our communities. To qualify for information and advice, the legal issue must fall into an area of practice that the clinic does, and you also must live in the catchment area of the clinic. And the case, in order to be represented, your case has to have sufficient merit, and you also do have to meet income and asset thresholds to be underneath those thresholds to qualify for representation. So thank you so much for being here today, and I'm happy to answer questions now, and I'm hoping that Francie can jump in and help me with answering the questions because she's got a lot of expertise here today, but I really thank everyone for listening and being so interested in this presentation today.
Stephanie, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. Then if anybody would like your PowerPoints, they can just email me, and I work with Stephanie in the same office. So she can just send them to me, and then it'll just be me sending them out instead of Stephanie because my workload tends to be a little bit less than hers. So
thank you, Debbie. That's the voice of Debbie Caswell, who's a community legal worker here at Grey Bruce Community Legal Clinic. So thanks, Debbie.
We have some questions.
Oh, you're muted, Francie.
Oh, we have some questions. We had many hands. So just start. You can just interrupt and just start just talking.
Would you like me to go through the names of people who have hands
I
up
saw,
and just
I
call them up?
saw, I saw people with the hand up before, but no now. So
I think
I remember that Swani had a question. I remember.
Brian asks if the tips can be made anonymously, Stephanie.
I don't know the answer to that. Francie, can tips be made anonymously to that government tip line?
For the tip line, yes. And it has the 24/7 hours available, and people can talk with an agent in more than 200 languages, or also can just apply. Yeah, I think
anonymous tips can be very dangerous. Yeah, sorry, I'm all for a tip line, but anonymous tips should be investigated before they're acted upon, is all I'm saying.
I think that they can lead to investigations, Brian. So I don't think that action is ever being taken without an investigation.
Yeah, usually we report these kind of issues to the local health unit of the Ministry of Labor, the inspector, specialized in temporary foreign workers, and they start just, they need always the information about the worker who is complaining, and after that they go to the inspection to the employer, to the farm. So yeah, so this kind of formal inspection has to have the name of the worker.
The only reason that it's really serious is that ESTC integrity branch, they take a very heavy hand when they're investigating complaints. And if they're anonymous, they may not be grounded in fact at all. And I've seen farms basically have their labor requirements frozen for months. And when you're growing crops, that means the loss of a production cycle. So it's something to take back. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks for sharing your perspective, Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, is there, I see a couple of other hands up at the moment.
Yeah. Connie from Cato. So Connie, you want to make a comment or a question or yeah, just go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, and for a very good presentation, and also Francie. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to comment on Roland's question around housing in New Brunswick, particularly with the seafood workers, because I've been in contact with the seafood plant workers, particularly in PEI. So it's true that employers would, even if it's identified as a company housing and not an apartment that that was agreed by the worker, that they will co-share for the cost of the apartment, but a company housing, they were charged, I think at the time was $65 a week. And when they claim it in their income tax or something, Service Canada put a halt and say, the employer's not supposed to charge you this much. And so they talk to the employer, and the employer have to refund the workers for the overpayment of, the housing. However, there are ways, and I think that continues until now, where employers would hide the charges on housing, and they would put in utilities or whatever to still keep it above the $30 per week that's regulated for farm workers, and in this case also the seafood or plant, the seafood workers. So workers need to know that there is a cap on how much the employers can charge, and therefore they can make this complaint or inform Service Canada if there's violation on this, on this issue. So I think it's, it's good for all of us to be reminded in your presentation, Stephanie, that there are regulations in place to make sure that the rent that the workers or the lodging accommodation that the workers are charged with are within the regulated amount. The other thing that I would like to comment on, and this is very, very kind of timely, because before you start before we started the webinar, I was speaking to Service Canada, like their inspection, the Workers Protection and Integrity Department, about some of the issues that we're facing as we receive it from the workers. We held a webinar on utilizing the tip lines. So the question around being able to file a complaint anonymously. Yes, of course, you can do that, but it doesn't really help a lot in terms of the government being able to move forward in terms of, taking action on the complaint. However, of course, workers are still afraid for appraisals, so that's still a barrier in terms of the workers being able to report. And I've invited the person at Service Canada if we can have another webinar in terms of what the workers should do if they filed the complaints and they haven't received a response, and if there's a reprisal, what protection the government can further provide them. And they're open to, to having that conversation. So yeah, like it's funny because the webinar also is very timely with regards to the Auditor General's report coming out today. And we also received the government's response to the report, and we shared it with partners. And I'm hoping that we can have a conversation sometime this week about this, their response, and really identify the sticking points in terms of what continues to happen, even if, we have these regulations in place and we have the tip line, and yet workers continue to experience differently. So I just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Connie.
Connie. Yeah, we really appreciate your comments and your suggestions and your clarifications. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Yeah, Roland.
Sorry, I kind of missed that one. So Connie, you mentioned that in Atlantic Canada, that I know a PI, but I think what's happening here in New Brunswick is so the employer itself, I would say, they put their own business. So it's not really the employer, but, it's like the managers are buying properties and they put them in this accommodation. So would that be considered as an employer a provided accommodation? Because that's what they've been doing. It's not under the name, the company's name, but it's it might be the owner, but it's outside. It's not, it's a secondary business. Because that's what they've been doing here, is they're buying big houses there and they put them all together there. So how do we categorize this kind of practice that they have? Is that subject also to these rules?
So I'm not, again, like I can't give, specific advice about that scenario, but I can share the legal information that where the employer owns rental housing and rents out that rental housing to the workers as like a separate business, but it's owned by the employer, then the rule for how much can be charged for rent is to take the market rent and divide it by the number of workers. So that would be the calculation of what is the fair rental rate in those types of circumstances.
Okay.
Stephanie,
Okay.
if I can add to that, I think, Roland, I think it's important for the workers to find out and look at their employment contract. If in the contract it says that their housing or accommodation is provided by the employer, because then, then it's clear that even in the LMIA and the contract that the government has a copy, that the housing or accommodation is provided by the employer, and therefore it should be within the regulation that's set for the accommodation that employers are providing. But if it's not, then it goes into that category that Stephanie said, that it becomes a renter-tenant, a tenant-landlord relationship, and they have the tenant's rights, right? And if
that's right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for the insight, and we'll dig into those information. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie, for that clarification.
Thanks. Okay, we had Aswani.
Thank you, Fanny. Hello, everybody. I just have a couple of questions. The first one is like what I have seen, and I'm a bit, it has been kind of the opposite of what I think a previous speaker or a person that was asking question, Brian, mentioned, that when you call the tip line and you do it confidential, they take it very seriously. I work like really closely with a lot of workers directly, and I have seen that it's still housing conditions. in based on these rules, they are not the best and they are not followed all the time. I know that sometimes they say like now because of COVID, inspectors were like a video, right, to inspect the houses or like that, and that's not the best way to do it either, because how can they ensure that those regulations are being followed? For me, I have also experienced that a lot of housings, they suffer from pests, specifically like a bed bugs. And bed bugs are really, really difficult to get rid of it, but they say they don't represent a problem to the health, but in my opinion, it is a problem to the health. And it's the same. What happens in those kind of situations when there is like a problem with a pest? It has to be some fumigation, but with bed bugs, you have to live for like a month or something like that. I'm not sure the rules, but it's a very hard pest to get rid of it. So if the workers have to be moved somewhere else, where will they be moved? And if there is another kind of like, I don't know, way to do this, or some other regulations or the tip line to help workers, because sometimes you can say that a farm is not following the rules and the inspector goes and you never have a way to follow up in that case. Even the person that does the complaint, there is not a follow-up. They don't show you what has been the process, what they have say, or if they are following and what has been fixed. That information is confidential. So it's very hard to follow up. Where I hear back from workers that they say, you know what, the housing is still the same bad conditions, the same pests, and the same problems. So you can call again and again, but the housing doesn't change. So I'm wondering, is there another route for workers, or another possibility to do in this case?
Okay, so I can start. So I mean, another option. I hear the frustration. Aswani, I really do think that it's a reality that sometimes these problems don't get addressed, and that the inspection requirements are not necessarily met. And we've heard these different perspectives on having a tip line, and concerns that it might be too stringent, and then concerns that of the opposite nature, that it's not going to do enough. Where there are concerns that are housing specific with things like bed bugs, those are things that can also be brought forward to local authorities, such as public health or municipal or provincial bylaw inspectors or property standards inspectors. They could also do that type of inspection, and that won't necessarily trigger those federal consequences. But I mean, bed bugs would be considered a health hazard and would be considered pests under either property standards or public health. So those would be two other places to try. I don't know if Francie wants to add on to that.
Yeah, in our cases.
I just wanted to interrupt. Yes, but it's not just about bed bugs. I'm just talking more in general. One part is bed bugs, but I can give you a big list, right? It's bed bugs. Okay, like what about heating? I have heard right now that there is not like a lot of houses with dry heating. Workers are getting really cold in the houses because they don't have proper heating in the housing. And things like that. So the list can go on and on. But like you say, I saw the presentation that fridge is one fridge for 6 people. But I didn't see the stove, and I don't know if I missed it. But stove, how many like stoves for people? Like 1 for 6 people? Because most of the bunk houses don't have even that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Francie.
No, I just want to mention here in Windsor, Essex, the employers and in other places are required to comply with the provincial and municipal housing requirements. So for example, here the Windsor Essex Health Unit, they do the inspection 8 months prior to the date when the employer apply for the LMII. And also we have the Ministry of Labor. When we have some issues with clients about housing, we refer them to the Ministry of Labor for the inspector. The inspector do the inspection and make some recommendations to the employer. So as a legal clinic, we had access to those recommendations. So we can see how was the result of the inspection. We can see and follow with the workers and with also the health unit, because they do every 8 months inspections to the farms and to the places. So here in Windsor, Essex, I can say it's not working bad. We had continued inspections by the health unit, and also we report to the Ministry of Labor some of the cases that we already have. And always the employers follow the recommendations as soon as obviously the Ministry of Labor visit them, so they follow the recommendations. I know there are some other places outside of Windsor and Essex that are still having workers in a very poor, poor living conditions. I know I received some pictures recently, but I don't know in the other regions how the health units are working, how many months, previously they are doing the inspections. In Windsor it's 8 months. I don't know in the other places. But we had cases, very serious cases in Simcoe, in Niagara. I know there are some cases. Yeah. So so in answering your question, the only option is the Windsor, the health unit in the local places, and the Ministry of Labor. They are doing the inspections. They have new rules. I remember Eduardo make webinar, I think 2 months ago, about the new rules for inspections from the Ministry of Labor, and they changed many things. So they are working on that. Yeah, so maybe Eduardo can explain us more about it.
Francie, just one more question to you. So do you say Windsor, but do you also cover Leamington, the Leamington area, right?
Windsor, Essex, yeah. All of our area, it was very hard in the past. I remember in 2017, we had a lot of crazy cases about many violations of the housing standards, but no, now, after I think 2 years ago, everything was changed and there are new regulations about it, about the inspections. So there are just a few cases in Windsor and Essex.
I have heard about in Leamington still, but I'm not sure why maybe nobody's really giving reporting them, right? And we say, sometimes you tell to the workers, we can do the confidential tip line for you, and they're still afraid of reprisals. So I think that's a big thing too, right? In this scenario. Okay, thank you, Francie, for clarifying that.
Thank you, Sonny, for your question. Yeah, so Eduardo, you can just talk about the new inspection requirements or your comments about it. So go ahead.
Oh, sure. And I had one quick kind of question, and I'm not in terms of what you're mentioning, I can maybe speak to a bit, but it was a while back, and I actually didn't fully understand some of the information that the ministry was presenting. But I think in a nutshell, it was that prior, the Ministry of Labor never saw the housing as an extension of the workplace. So the Ministry of Labor actually used to not inspect housing. And it was a strange, and my colleague Michelle too, that I think just left, there was a lot of pointing to kind of a gap in that, because WSIB considers the housing as an extension of the workplace. So if a worker is actually injured within the space of housing, they can still file a claim. That space is still understood as a workplace related space that could then translate into compensation. But before, the Ministry of Labor was not inspecting. So during COVID, what they started saying is that they were extending to looking at the housing in the context of COVID-19 safety, but it was unclear as to whether they were like under what they were enforcing that, or because they also talked about then increasing collaboration with the health units. So I'm not sure if it was more that the ministry would come look at the hazard of COVID, extending that into how the housing is being organized, and if they saw something specific to housing, if they would then just relate it to the health unit that they said that they were now collaborating with more, or if it was being addressed from their legislation around health and safety. So that part is where I'm not fully sure. But one thing I was going to mention, and I know that this presentation, it's really useful information. I know that you're looking at what currently are the regulations and what currently we know, but I just wondered if there was any kind of thinking or comments around how this relates to the consultation, the federal housing consultation that was open, and I think it's going to be a year from this month. And just this month, the federal government released, I guess, I think it's a document called like What We Heard or something. And I was going to put it in the chat in case people hadn't seen it, but this is the document that the government of Canada released based on what everybody, so many different groups basically put into accommodations. Just because I think, it's interesting to know what workers can claim now, but I think we have to look at, pushing these standards up, right? Because these are, in a lot of cases, these are very minimal standards. And from an occupational health and safety perspective, like we are starting to look at workplace stress, workplace conditions that have like mental health implications on workers. And I think housing is such a big part of this, even 6 people to 1 fridge, that's a lot of people, or sharing space and having very little privacy. And not only when these standards are actually abided by, and was, as we're hearing, there's still cases where they're not, but even at these standards, it's what can we really do to improve things, because some of these standards are very minimal and maybe not conducive to people getting good rest, feeling in a wellness kind of stress associated with that. But I'll put that out there. And then one thing too, it's another little gap, but we were looking at pesticide safety. So, pesticides continues to be something that we hear a lot about, concerns from workers. And in the slide, when you mentioned kind of the safety requirements of where housing shouldn't be located near, for example, flammable products or whatnot, we also were trying to investigate in our consultation, and when we put our submission to the consultation was also to look at the distance of the housing in relation to treated fields or treated like by pesticides, or areas that are being treated by pesticides. And I think that was not something that seems to be considered in terms of worker housing, to make sure that it is far away from where pesticides are being applied, because if not, then we've had reports of workers being worried about drifting actually really close to housing, or they're saying that they can even smell some sort of product into their housing, right? So that's kind of another area that we've been trying to figure out and look for best practices around. But I don't know if anybody else, about the consultations, or if you have any kind of thoughts about the consultations or anything around that. But thank you. But it's great information.
Thank you, Eduardo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. These are great points to raise.
Yeah, thanks for the links. Yeah, I know there are some also, because we are following the housing standards requirements in they are the standards, right? So they usually assess some kind of areas or risk for the workers, but sometimes they, as you mentioned, Eduardo, they don't include about pesticides, about, for example, the pets, no the pets, the pesticides and the, for example, when Aswani mentioned the bed bugs, they are not considered as a higher risk of workers. So yeah, there are specific standards that the inspectors has to follow and to see when they visit the accommodations. So they are not going to watch everything in detail, just they follow and check the list to follow the requirements and just obviously do recommendations about it. Yeah.
And I think it's a great point to raise too, that that there are 2 different sets of concerns that can be raised here. One is what happens when these requirements are not met, and that's one set of concerns. And then, like Eduardo said, there's also just the concern around, are these standards and these requirements really good enough? And so that's the other, there's sort of a reactive question and then a more proactive question. And I think it's a really good question to ask. Do these standards do enough to ensure that workers can be healthy and safe and well while they're here, so that they can do the work that they're here to do and leave healthy, right? So that's, I think that's a really good thing to think about too.
Yeah, you are right, Stephanie. Yeah, we have Connie has another question.
It's not a question, but I guess, to note that we have two sources of in legislation or regulation that's in place. And so this is the federal and the provincial, right? And how do we make sure that they're not contradicting each other? And also in terms of them communicating internally as government agencies to make sure that, what the other is doing, that they're both aware, and that they're also able to respond to the worker situation in a more cohesive way and also productive way. So yeah, because sometimes and often within the government bureaucracy, the left would not know what the right hand is doing. So just, putting that out. And I think with the Attorney General's report, this is, I think, an opportunity for us to come out in whatever form, whether it's a briefing document, it's a set of recommendations assigned by different groups by us with regards to reiterating the sticking points in that report, in again, advocating for a stronger protection and addressing the housing issues that many of the workers continue to face.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Connie raised that idea too of the federal requirements and then the more local requirements, because I know, for example, Aswani had raised the issue of heat and insufficient heat within a house, and that there is the requirement that the house be able to be heated sufficiently. But if that's an immediate concern, that is also something that falls within municipal bylaws in most communities that I'm aware of. So most community bylaws have rules around the heat that must be able to be maintained within a dwelling during the winter months. So it's helpful to understand that there are those two sets of regulations, and that, really, if you're looking for a specific fix or a specific remedy, that it may sometimes be better just to go the local route and get the local municipal property standards inspector to come and look at a place and say, okay, this is not being heated sufficiently, because that does fall within their purview. And then that would not necessarily have any employment implications, but it would just be a strictly, this municipality has this rule and this housing doesn't fall within that rule. So that's a good thing to highlight too, is that we're looking at multiple schemes that regulate some of the same things with different intents and purposes, but they can get to the same result.
Yeah. Yes, you're right, Stephanie. Okay, we have Sharon.
Hi, Stephanie. Hi, Francine.
Hi, Sharon.
Okay.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi. I have 2 points in mind. Number one, just to follow up on what Eduardo shared about the consultation. I think that's an awesome effort, but I'm just wondering, is there any way we can disperse the information to really directly get the TFWs involved so that they can give their own opinions and their own, perspective, because they are the ones experiencing the hardship in their housing. So I'm just wondering, is there any way, aside from us community outreach workers, because sometimes, that's the challenge itself, right? That's the very reason why some farmers don't want us in their properties, not in their properties, not in their farm, not even to see their housing, because, these are the reasons why they want to stay away from us. So I'm just wondering, if we can't reach those workers, is there any other avenues that, I don't know, the government or other agencies could do so that you can reach the TFWs from the get-go, like even when they arrive in Canada, maybe give the information right away to empower them from the start so that we avoid all this, being taken advantage of.
Yeah, we during the care sessions, Kairos Care presentations, part of the project, we had a presentation about housing, and we were able to provide information, housing and standard requirements, and also about the consultation during the session for the temporary foreign workers. But this is just for a few workers, but it would be better if we can, yes, you're right, if we can just, I think, maximize and we can just cover most of the workers. Yeah, it's something that we have to organize more, or maybe just had a participation into the consultation, and we will see. Yeah, we can plan.
Yeah. Thank you, Francie. That's the first part. And the second one is, Stephanie, for you, when you mentioned the $30 cap per week for farm workers, is that specific only to farm workers? Or does that also apply to different industries, like say retail or whatever other TFWs we have coming in? Because I have a bunch of TFWs, and they actually asked me, can we live in your house instead? Because, we're being charged $750 to $950 per person. They're new here in Canada. They don't know anyone else. And it's not the employer providing the housing, but it's the employer's friend or friend's friend. But they, of course, they got that contact from the employer. So it's really kind of cheeky and tricky. I just wonder how we can, help this kind of, situations. And if that cap only applies to farm workers, or does it apply to TFWs in general?
So that's a really good question. And so that cap applies to that cap applies in circumstances where the employer is providing housing as part of the employment contract. So where the workers are farm workers living on a farm, the cap is $30 a week. Where the workers live off-site, it's $30 a week for unskilled workers, and then, lower skilled workers, sorry, my mistake. And then it's up to 30% of the workers' monthly income for higher skilled workers. And by the skill levels, I refer to, the skills level that's designated by Canada on their work permit. So in a circumstance where workers are living in rental housing that's not owned by the employer, it sounds as though that's probably not employer provided housing set out within the employment contract. So those limitations would not apply. However, if a worker is in rental housing, that rental housing would be covered by the Residential Tenancies Act of Ontario, if they're in Ontario, which I know in your case we are.
Yeah.
So those workers could get some legal advice about their rights under the Residential Tenancies Act with respect to that particular housing, and whether they wanted to search for alternative housing. They would have the right to move to alternative housing, but they would want to speak with a lawyer to figure out, what they need to do in terms of breaking a lease and so on. And just to go back to your first point, Sharon, I think that, what this what I really see from our region anyway, and this kind of covers both of the things you're talking about, is the social isolation that a lot of temporary foreign workers experience. I can say certainly in our region is part of what makes workers vulnerable. And we know that there are many employers out there who do really care about their workers and do provide adequate housing and are fair employers, and may have the same workers coming back year after year and have good relationships. So, you know, this is not to paint all employers as breaking rules or being exploitative. But I think that whether the temporary foreign workers are being treated well or not, there is a real lack of connection to the permanent residents in a lot of the communities where they're working. And that's where the workers can end up being quite vulnerable if there is someone, whether it's the employer or someone else, who wants to exploit that. So I think that's where, you know, the work of community outreach workers and programming around building those connections is really important. And like I said, even for the workers who are being treated completely fairly and well by their employers, just the fact that they're isolated can be tough for their well-being and their mental health. So I think that's, you know, sometimes that work can seem like it's not as important, but I think that it really is important, because by creating more connections, it reduces the possibilities for any type of exploitation, whether it's by employers or by other people.
Thank you, Stephanie. And one last point for me. I wonder, you know, I was really curious, and you know, when Francie shared that in Windsor, Essex, they get like the housing check prior to 8 months of arrival of the TFW, and after that, another 8 months check. That's a good way of checking on the proper housing. But then I also wonder, because I have a few people who told me these are TFWs that works in farms. Of course, you know, they will check, and then they will show a different kind of accommodation that's really gonna pass. And then after a few months, they will move into living inside the barns. Can you imagine how barns smell? And you know, it's how cold it is in the winter and how hot it is in the summer. But then they don't have you know, the voice to speak out about it. Like they told me they're not really like forced to live there. They said, well, you can live outside, but here it's going to be free or lower fees. But then, yeah, I sometimes it's just, you know, it comes to my mind as if like there's so many ways to go around rules and regulations, and some employers, I think, are really just too smart about it. And I just wonder how we can really empower TFWs in those kind of cases. Because like you said in the earlier presentation too, Stephanie, you know, it's tricky because before they become whistleblowers, before they even report, they must actually consult a legal consultant, because it affects, you know, obviously they're scared of losing their job, and it really affects their employment. So it's just really a trap for TFWs. That's it for me today. Thank you.
No, and I thank you for giving that perspective, Sharon. And I think that's something that concerns everybody in this call, is that, you know, the reality is that temporary foreign workers are vulnerable, and where any group of people is vulnerable, unfortunately, you will find some people who are honest and, you know, fair in their interactions with those people, but you'll find some people who will exploit that, and that is what happens, and it's unfortunate that happens. But I think that that's where, you know, the work of so many people everybody's contribution matters in this work of trying to make sure that these issues are understood. And it comes from people who are connected to temporary foreign workers. It comes from the employer side as well, from employers who themselves, want these rules to be better enforced and fair. And it comes from community partners who care about the well-being of the workers, and then, just people in our communities. So, but you're right that there are all kinds of vulnerabilities here.
Yeah, Connie?
I just wanted to add a bit of information with regards to Sharon's earlier question around house accommodation cost. And I would say, I think this depends on what stream you are in. For example, in the past, if you are a live-in caregiver, or if you are a caregiver living in with your employers, the cap is $85 a week. So that includes the room and food. Because in the caregiver program, caregivers are supposed to be provided with, their own room with a lock. To make sure that they are safe, because they're living in, their employer's household, so that to make sure that they are safe, that the room they are provided with has, they can lock it from the inside. So that's $85 a week. And I guess in other industries, like those in the fast food chains, or in the hospitality, for example, the Blue Mountain Resort, the workers who are living as who are working as chambermaids or servers, they're provided with company housing. I spoke to some of the workers. I think they are actually paying $500 a month for their accommodation. If that is the regulated amount, I have not checked, but that's what they are paying. And in one housing, like in one unit, there's about 13 workers. And if you can just imagine, each worker paying $500 a month, that's $6,500 revenue per month, whether it's an employer's friend or an employer's housing unit, but not declared as the official accommodation for these workers. Yeah.
Thank you, Connie, for sharing that. It's a surprise. Oh my God. Yeah. I think if somebody has some more questions. There are not questions in the chat. We almost finished. It's 3:32. So I think there are no more questions. Just I want to say thank you, everybody. Thank you for the participants for this webinar. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your information, your amazing presentation and slides. This presentation will be posted for watching for the public, available for everybody. After this session, will be posted in Facebook Care, in the Facebook of Care, and also I think David is also helping us posting the videos in the Empowering for Temporary Foreign Workers project in Kairos. So it's available. I think the slides will be also available for everybody. And thank you so much. Thank you and have a good day. Thank you, Connie, for your comments. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And thank you, Stephanie, and see you for the next webinar. And have a nice weekend.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you for having me, Francie, and thanks so much, everyone, for your questions and comments. It really makes it more interesting for everyone, so we appreciate them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.